Let's finish our tissue talk by looking at muscle tissue. And muscle tissue can contract and relax. And there are three types of muscle: skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. And as we talk about muscle tissue, whether now or in a future unit, we may use different terminology, like instead of saying cytoplasm, you'll hear sarcoplasm. Instead of saying cell membrane, which can also be called the plasma lemma, we'll say sarcolemma. So this term sarco that you keep seeing, uh, really what it means is flesh. And if you've heard of the term sarcophagus, one of these stone coffins used in ancient Egypt and Rome, a sarcophagus means a flesh eater, right? Because PHAG, phag, means to eat. So sarcophagus is a flesh eater. Skeletal muscle is found attached to bones and sometimes to the skin. So what it can do for you is whenever you want to voluntarily move your skeleton, you're using skeletal muscle. But also if you want to smile or frown, then the muscles attached to your skin will help you with your facial expressions. Skeletal muscle is also found in sphincters. So like if you are doing the pee-pee dance and you really got to go, you're using skeletal muscle to prevent urination from happening at that moment. You're closing a sphincter. There's also an anal sphincter that has the same potential. Skeletal muscle generates heat when it contracts and relaxes, and it helps protect some of your internal organs, like that six pack you got going on your abs. That's good protection for your abdominal organs. That's why I have mine. To describe skeletal muscle, we would say it is made of these long, parallel cylindrical cells that we call fibers. You know, they're very thin, but they're very long. So they're kind of like strings or threads or fibers. If we look in this image here, we can see that there are many, many, many little black dots on these fibers. Those are the nuclei. These skeletal muscle fibers, they originate from the fusion of a bunch of smaller cells. So you can get dozens or hundreds of nuclei in each of these skeletal muscle fibers. And they're peripheral, meaning they're kind of pushed to the edge, because as these fibers contract and relax, you don't want the nuclei getting smushed inside of the cell. So they're off on the edges of the cell. The other thing you can see on skeletal muscle quite well are striations. These alternating dark and light bands are called striations, and those have to do with how muscle tissue contracts. We're going to learn all about striations when we do a whole unit on muscle. Smooth muscle is not attached to bone and skin. Smooth muscle is found in the walls of hollow organs and blood vessels. So pretty much your entire GI tract, right? Starting with your oral cavity down to your anus, most of that is all smooth muscle. As soon as you swallow your food, smooth muscle is going to do the rest. It'll push the food down your esophagus to your stomach. The stomach will churn up the food. The intestines will further mix the food. And as the food moves through from each of these organs from one to the next, sphincters will open and close on their own to facilitate the digestive process. All that is smooth muscle. But smooth muscle is also found in your airway and in your blood vessels. So as your blood pressure changes throughout the day, that's partially due to smooth muscle in your blood vessels contracting or relaxing. Thinking about your airway, if you're in a fight or flight situation, the smooth muscle will relax to allow more air to enter and exit your lungs. If you have an asthma attack, smooth muscle is constricting and causing the diameter of your airway to shrink. To find smooth muscle in the body, you would be looking for what are called either fusiform shaped cells or spindle shaped cells. So to help you understand what these terms mean, A fusiform shaped cell is shaped like a fuselage of a plane. I also didn't know what a fuselage was, so this is good learning for me, of course. A fuselage is just this portion of the plane without the wings or the tailpiece. So I put a smooth muscle cell right on top so you can see what we're saying is basically this is a cell that tapers at the ends. I didn't really know what a spindle was either, except it's like a, not Cinderella, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs story has a spindle. So this part of a sewing machine is a spindle. I don't know, but it's tapered at the ends. The thing about smooth muscle is you don't see any striations, those alternating light and dark bands. There are none. That doesn't mean smooth muscle can't contract. Remember, all muscle contracts. That's what it does. It just means that the way the internal mechanisms of the cell are arranged, you can't really see the striations. We'll talk about it more in next unit or two. Cardiac muscle is found in the heart. It's involuntarily controlled, just like smooth muscle, right? You can't control what your stomach and your intestines are doing. You can't really control what your heart is doing. It's going to contract at its own pace. The cells are branched. So you can see that better here in like a cartoon version, that you see some branching of these cells. Typically, there's just one nucleus. And the striations are visible, although not as well as in skeletal muscle. So in the histology view of this, I can make out some alternating light and dark bands, but not quite as clearly. The other thing that cardiac muscle has is called an intercalated disc. Intercalated discs are the junction between the cells. And if you think way back to our first topic of second topic, talking about the cell, we talked about the different types of cell junctions. And we said that cardiac cells in the heart need special junctions. Because these cells we're seeing here, they need to communicate very efficiently to make sure your heart contractions beat with the smooth rhythm. And they need a lot of support so that all these heartbeats don't slowly pull your cells apart. So they use desmosomes and gap junctions at these intercalated discs to make sure the cells stay together and can communicate. That's what an intercalated disc is just the cell-to-cell junction. Here we can see there are these little dark lines, but just be forewarned, depending on the staining and things like that, sometimes those lines come out light colored. Okay, so here's just a little walkthrough of some of the abilities and characteristics of muscle tissue. Some muscle tissue can be voluntarily controlled, meaning you think it and it happens. Which types of muscle tissue do that? Only skeletal muscle. Maybe if you're like a CIA spook, you can slow your heart rate down to beat a lie detector test or something, but we're saying that in general, in a normal person, you can only control skeletal muscle. Which types of muscle tissue can you see striations on? Skeletal and cardiac. Which types of muscle have multiple peripheral nuclei? Only skeletal. If you want to direct your eyeballs, what type of tissue do you use? Well, be careful here. I'm saying to direct your eyeballs, to look around the room. If I decide I want to do it, then it happens. That means I'm voluntarily controlling what my eyeballs are getting up to. That means it's skeletal tissue. There is also smooth muscle in your eyeballs. That's what makes your pupils dilate and contract when you go from dark to light rooms. But directing your eyeballs, that's skeletal muscle. Where do we find intercalated discs? In cardiac muscle. Where do we find spindle or fusiform shaped cells? That's in smooth muscle. What about the urinary and anal sphincters? Well, we said if you're doing the pee-pee dance, you're using skeletal muscle. You're voluntarily deciding to hold that urethra closed so that you don't pee. But what about when you're sleeping? You know, a lot of the time you're not consciously keeping your sphincters closed, and yet you don't pee the bed or poop the bed. So there are also smooth muscle sphincters in the urinary and anal regions. So two types of sphincters, some you can control and some you can't. What about the gastroesophageal sphincter? The sphincter that separates the gastric region, stomach, from the esophagus. You want to see me open mine right now? I can't. I can't voluntarily control that sphincter. So that must be all smooth muscle. Responsible for body's locomotion is, of course, skeletal muscle. Changes the internal volume of a blood vessel or an organ. Well, I know, like, when the heart beats, it gets bigger and smaller. So this must be cardiac muscle, right? You're half right. What about changing the internal volume of a blood vessel? Blood vessels can dilate and blood vessels can constrict. So too can your airway. So actually this is both cardiac muscle and smooth muscle. So that was just a fun way to revisit some of the topics we talked about with muscle tissue. Now we'll take a very brief look at nervous tissue because we have just about an entire unit dedicated to studying this tissue in more detail. We'll just say that you find the nervous tissue in the nervous system, like the brain and spinal cord and nerves. Its job is to transmit electrical impulses through the body. And the types of cells that you'll find in nervous tissue are neurons and neuroglial cells, or just glial cells. They're like supporting cells. In this image, we can see an entire neuron and some of the parts of the neuron. In this histological view, we can see the body or soma of a neuron. And then floating around the neuron are these other little small cells. Those are the glial cells. Okay, so we'll talk about a few more things to finish out our big chunk of tissue information, starting with membranes. Membranes are continuous, flat, multicellular sheets. And they will cover body parts and line body parts. So in specific parts of your body, you have these membranes that are made of both epithelial tissue and connective tissue. I don't want you to think about some very simple, basic linings in your body, right? Like, well, what lines the inside of blood vessels? It's just simple squamous epithelium. It's not a membrane with all this connective tissue and stuff. We're just saying here that there are 4 types of membranes that are bigger, thicker, special types of membranes that line or cover things. So first is the cutaneous membrane. That just means the skin. So you've got skin on the outside of your body. You've got keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Plus you've got that areolar connective tissue underneath, gluing the epidermis to the dermis. You've also have a lot of mucous membranes in your body. Pretty much anywhere your body opens up to the outside world, you're going to have this moist, mucousy membrane. And the mucus is going to help make a buffer to keep any potential pathogens out of your body. And the mucus is also good at trapping those pathogens so you can get rid of them. There are different types of epithelium, but they're always glued to this connective tissue underneath. And you have openings in your body for your airway, so like your nostrils and nasal cavity. That's part of your respiratory system. That has a mucous membrane. Your digestive tract, like your oral cavity and esophagus and your anus, has a mucous membrane. Your urinary system, like your urethra, urine will come out, but bacteria will try to get in there too. So you have a mucous membrane. And reproductive regions. Males use the urethra for reproductive functions, but females also have the vaginal canal that will have a mucous membrane. It's all about making this protective layer around these areas that are open to the outside world. Serous membranes we already talked about. So if you want to know more, you can revisit the first topic we did when we did serous membranes. As a quick refresher, those were the 3 Ps: the pericardium, the peritoneum, and the pleural membranes. And last, there's a special type of membrane called synovial membranes. Those are found inside your joint cavities. There's areolar connective tissue, and they secrete this lubricating fluid to make sure your joints are friction-free environments. Okay, there's a few more slides here that are just some definitions of some common terminology that has to do with your cells and tissues. I won't actually walk you through each of these. It's just a few slides. You can read through these, learn about atrophy versus hyperplasia and so on. Learn about which tissues regenerate quickly and which don't. You might not be surprised to find out, for example, that cartilage is something that doesn't regenerate very well. Tissues and aging. Again, you could just read through a few things here. It's kind of just a very basic introduction to some of these concepts. And I'll just leave you with this last slide showing some of our favorite celebs. See if you can tell who they are. They've used that aging app to make themselves appear older. And this is just to give you an idea of when you think about aging, you can pick really any of the organ systems. And we know, as through research and science, we know a lot about the changes that take place in those organ systems as we age. So just as an example, looking at the skin of these celebs and how it's changed, you can see, for example, that mitosis, the way that cells are replaced, that's slowed down as these celebs age. The dermis becomes thinner. You have less fat in the hypodermis, so less cushioning, less insulation. Less vasculature, so you have fewer blood vessels and fewer sweat glands. Blood and sweat are both part of keeping skin healthy and moist. Fewer hair follicles, of course. The Rock knows what I'm talking about. You know what I mean? Dwayne Johnson. And fewer sebaceous glands, so less oil on the surface of the skin, which also helps keep the skin supple. Sun damage will accumulate, wrinkles will form, etc. So just a quick look at just one organ system and how aging can affect things. We can thank our celebs for their guest appearance here. Hope you enjoyed the topic. See you next time.